Hi everyone, welcome to SLA YouTube channel, and I'm very happy about today because my friend and colleague Luke Plonsky is here with us, and he's going to give us a guest lecture. Okay, so before everything, let me introduce Luke Plonsky. Luke, again, thank you so much for being a part of our YouTube SLA project and agreeing to give a talk for us. And I'm very happy to introduce my friend, colleague Luke. And Luke Plonsky is Associate Professor of Applied Linguistics at Northern Arizona University. He obtained his PhD in 2011 with Susan Gass as his supervisor. And since then, 10 years have passed. To me, only 10 years have passed. Without any doubt, Luke Plonsky is one of the most active, passionate, well-rounded, and influential leaders of the field of second language acquisition as of 2021. And his research area focuses on a wide range of second language acquisition and individual differences in classroom settings. What makes Luke very much distinguishable and well-renowned is his very active advocacy of methodological rigor and reform and renovation in the field of second language acquisition. He has been publishing a number of books and journal articles in very prestigious international journals. In particular, this is my favorite paper, his paper, How Big is Big? Interpreting Effect Sizes in L2 Speech, published in Language Learning 2014, set up the field-specific benchmark about how to measure effect sizes for SLA researchers for the first time. This paper has already been cited 722 times according to Google Scholar. It's a must-read and must-cite paper for all researchers. And then Luke's contribution to the community is immense. Luke is Associate Editor of Studies in Second Language Acquisition. Luke, this is actually very important for everyone to know, because in an interview, we'll definitely talk about how to publish and enjoy the writing papers in international journals. So
great, okay.
Yeah, good. And okay, and he's also the managing editor of Foreign Language Annals, and he serves on the editorial boards of Language Teaching and Learning, Learning and Individual Differences. He's also co-director of IRIS Repository for Instruments in Language Learning and Teaching Research. Not only that, Luke is also very active and influential in social media to promote and enhance the awareness of methods in applied linguistics. He's a founder and host of the most popular SLA group on Facebook, Applied Linguistics Research Methods Discussion, where there are about 18,000 subscribers as of now, and many discuss a range of issues related to methods in SLA. And Luke very actively promotes a discussion and provides advice to students and junior colleagues all over the world, which is really amazing to me. As everyone knows, Luke is a guru of meta-analysis in the field of SLA. By using this very unique statistical method, he has synthesized a range of topics in SLA, such as how much instruction is effective and what type of instruction is effective in various areas of language, grammar, pronunciation, strategy. Thanks to his impactful work, the number of meta-analysis studies has been skyrocketing. And I'm pretty sure now we can say meta-analysis is a buzzword, still buzzword in SLA. So students, researchers, teachers, everyone who is interested in SLA, this is a fantastic news. For this special events, I asked Luke a special request, and he has agreed on this. Today, to my knowledge, for the first time, Luke is going to give us his summary talk and his view on what a meta-analysis has contributed to our understanding of instructed SLA. This is a precious opportunity to learn from him. Please join me welcoming Professor Luke Plonsky.
Well, Kazuya, thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor. Thank you for the very generous introduction as well. It's great to be here with you and for your subscribers and your whole community to come talk about meta-analysis and instructed second language acquisition. I have here, just as a kind of starting point, I have here a picture of the Grand Canyon, and I put that there not only because I'm from Arizona, where the Grand Canyon is located, but also because to me it sort of represents kind of a metaphor of what we get from this sort of view from above. We get this. That's what meta-analysis gives us, is this kind of view from above of this grand prospect of research on instructed second language acquisition. And so that's sort of what we're going to do here. And that's what meta-analysis provides us with. And before we get into the actual meta-analysis discussion proper, I wanted to start off with a little bit of kind of like really, really broad, high level thinking, high level meaning sort of broad, like taking a step back for a second. And this is sort of my view on how we kind of model or theoretically think about all the different variables. And anybody who knows anything about SLA or about second language teaching and learning knows that there's so many different variables that come into play in understanding second language development. And this is sort of the way I kind of conceptualize it, that we can talk about. I put them into 2 or maybe 3 kind of big buckets or categories. And I like to think of the first, one of the main buckets or categories of variables that contribute to understanding second language development being learner internal mechanisms and learner internal processes. Sometimes we talk about these like individual differences, but that doesn't necessarily work for everything. And then I like to think about the other side of the equation, one of the other main sides of the equation, and that would be learner external mechanisms and processes. And these are some of the variables that really come into play when we talk about instructed second language acquisition. Of course, these can also overlap and interact with each other as well. And then the third main category also is that I like to include in my modeling or understanding of variables that are associated with or predictive of second language development are the language specific features specific to the L1 or to the L2 or the relationship between them, some of the individual, for example, morphosyntactic or phonological features of a particular language that can be associated with greater or lesser development. Okay, so with this kind of global understanding, what I want us to do in today's discussion is to ask the question of what has meta-analysis told us about this side, the left-hand side of the equation, of the variables that are associated with second language development. And I'll start off with a spoiler alert that instruction works. Okay, instruction does have an effect on second language development. The more interesting question to ask, of course, at this point where we are in the development of the field is how much of an effect does it have? And when and under what circumstances is instruction most effective in leading to second language development? And these are the types of questions that meta-analysis is really well suited to help us answer. All right, so with that said, the objectives for this little discussion, this is going to be fairly informal, are first to understand the effectiveness of second language instruction overall across different skill areas, and then some of the variables that influence the effectiveness of L2 instruction. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do, sort of a practical kind of goal. What has meta-analysis told us so far in the last 20 or so years of its usage in applied linguistics? And then second, I kind of just want you to see, and I want to explain a little bit of in accomplishing objective number 1, see a little bit of the potential of meta-analysis as a way of organizing findings across studies, because it really does provide us with a really powerful set of techniques for doing that. Okay, so with that, so first is I kind of want to just pose a couple of questions and just for something you to think about, the meta-analysis is essentially a type of lit review. Okay, and we've all written lit reviews. Anytime you in any very, very common course assignment, write a synthesis paper or a literature review, or you write a lit review in preparation for collecting data for a primary study, to motivate the study, to situate the research. We think about that process. There are a number of different, there are a few strengths, but there are a number of different weaknesses that can actually present threats to the validity of a literature review. And I know that not everybody thinks about literature reviews that way as having a kind of outcome or potentially even having threats. But when we do a lit review, usually we're looking to find out, we're trying to figure out the answer to a question. Even though we don't always pose research questions for lit reviews, I actually prefer that we do, that we pose research questions and say, well, what are we trying to figure out here? We're trying to figure out what's the relationship between A and B? What's the effect of X on Y? And so if we think of it that way, we can think of lit reviews as a way of not just summarizing existing research, but also arriving at conclusions to some of our questions that we have about L2 development, for example. In any case, the process that most of us would take in putting together a traditional lit review would be something like, and this may be different for you, but probably something like, you go to the library website, you put in some keyword searches, you get some articles, you download some articles, you read those, you take some notes, and then hopefully things start to kind of come together into, you start to see patterns, you start to observe trends across the literature, and maybe you see, oh, I've got a few studies that support this, a few studies that support that, and then you try and see what seems to be the dominant view from the body of literature that you're interested in. Well, I also want to ask, can you think of any challenges or disadvantages to this approach? Well, there are a few. There are a few important problems, and this became very salient in the 1970s, which is when meta-analysis was first kind of developed by researchers in education and psychology primarily. They realized that these tools that we're using, this traditional narrative way of reviewing an existing body of work on a given topic, has flaws in it. And some of those flaws come in other words, we can think of them as threats to the validity of the lit review, in the fact that sometimes our searches are not thorough. And not only are they not thorough, but we might be more likely to include in our lit reviews papers or findings that confirm what we hope or expect to find. And so what we don't get from a traditional lit review is a really comprehensive view of the relationship between A and B, or the effect of X on Y, for example. We might come to a conclusion that sort of confirms the bias that we have going into it, for example. Another problem with lit reviews is that, traditional lit reviews, is that there's just so much going on. Let's say you go through that traditional process and you download 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 articles that are all looking at the effect of X on Y. And in our field, and anytime you're doing work with human subjects, social science research, there's so many different variables involved. And so it's literally impossible to keep track of all the relevant variables. And like those two circles on the previous slide of, the learn internal variables and learn external variables and the language specific variables. And you have different contexts, and you've got different target features, and you've got different learner backgrounds, demographics, different types of treatments. It's impossible to keep track of all that information. Even if you take really good notes, it's impossible to keep track of all the information in a systematic way, just in your head or in your note system. So, and then a third problem with a traditional lit review is that oftentimes the results are based, we over-interpret, or we put too much weight on whether or not a particular finding was statistically significant or not. And that's sort of a binary way of thinking about results, whereas we know that most of the time we're talking about continuously measured variables. And that's certainly the case in most instructed psycholanguage acquisition research. So how does the meta-analytic process differ? Well, from the meta-analytic point of view, what we want to do is we're going to turn that process of conducting a literature review into a study, into an empirical process. And so what that gives us is, what do I mean by empirical? I mean that process is going to become more systematic, more objective, and more transparent, sort of in parallel to a primary study. I'm not saying that the meta-analytic process is totally systematic always. There's judgment involved. I'm not saying that it's totally objective. Again, there's judgment involved, and we're not always as transparent as we should be or could be, but we want these features of systematicity, objectivity, and transparency to not only be part of our primary research, but also the secondary research, the process by which we synthesize and bring together results on a common question. So three key features to point out that and that distinguish the meta-analytic approach to secondary research is that it's exhaustive as opposed to selective. So we try to include in our sample the entire population of studies on a given topic, as opposed to being selective, which can lead to bias. Okay, so by being exhaustive, we get greater generalizability of our findings from the lit review, and we get reduced bias. We get what we're going to do to get over that problem of the difficulty and really the impossibility of keeping track of all the different findings, the learners, the target features, the contexts, the treatment features, the length and intensity, and all those things that can affect the findings of a study, all the variables that matter. We can't keep track of all that. In the meta-analytic approach, we code each study systematically for all the features that matter. And then we're able to look at those features as predictors or moderators of the study outcomes. Okay. And then, yeah, just as an example, oftentimes, if a traditional approach might involve taking notes in the margins of PDFs, and it might look something like that, as opposed to something like this. So very systematic coding scheme. Again, in parallel to primary research, treating each study like a participant, we collect systematically the same data from each study, just like we would collect the same items from participants in a primary study. Okay, and then third, the key component of effect sizes, as opposed to null hypothesis significance testing or p-values. Effect sizes give us a standardized measure of the strength of a relationship or the size of an effect of an intervention, for example. And effect sizes are more precise, they're more stable, they're actually more intuitive, and they're more informative than a p-value, which is the more traditional approach. Okay, so with that as kind of introduction, or I should say, as a result of all these benefits that we get from meta-analysis, the growth of meta-analysis has been exponential, looking across all these other fields, from medicine to ecology to economy, looking across the broader language sciences. These are a number of hits for just the term meta-analysis and the LLBA, which is a database, languages and linguistics behavior abstracts. And how about applied linguistics? Well, as Kazuya mentioned, we've seen massive growth in the use of meta-analytic techniques and synthetic techniques in applied linguistics over the last couple decades. And I have here, I actually maintain a bibliography on the use of meta-analysis in applied linguistics, and we'll link that right below the video. We'll link in case you want to see what has been done in applied linguistics using meta-analytic tools. So, but the question that we want to address in this discussion is, what have these meta-analyses taught us about ISLA? So here we're just focusing on, we're not focusing on all of applied linguistics. We're just looking at really one corner, one important corner, but one corner of applied linguistics, and that's instructed second language acquisition. So what has meta-analysis been able to provide us with in terms of findings? But before we get into that, one other sort of preliminary note, and most of these, the results I'm going to show here are going to come from this kind of design. This is a kind of typical design in ISLA, or instructed second language acquisition. There are many, many decisions that come into play here. I'm not going to go through all this, but the main thing I want to point out is just that when the effects we're talking about in these studies are coming from right here. They're coming usually from a comparison between an experimental group and a control group on some kind of post-test that is given to participants after some kind of treatment or intervention. Okay, and so this relationship here, or this difference, is what we're usually talking about between an experimental group and a control group. That's what we're measuring, or we're estimating as the outcome that is then synthesized or aggregated via meta-analysis. So what is the effectiveness of X? All right. This is each of these bars here represents a meta-analytic effect, what's called a D-value, one of the effect size indices I mentioned before, that represents the effectiveness of, these are the 4 different areas we're going to cover in this brief discussion: grammar instruction, the effectiveness of vocabulary instruction, pragmatics instruction, and pronunciation instruction. And we see a couple different things. First of all, I just want to point out, this is sort of the broad view, looking across all these different meta-analyses of instructed second language acquisition. We see, first of all, that instruction is effective. Second of all, that it is often quite effective. You can see for lots across different domains, we see fairly large effects across different domains of ISLA. And third of all, we see that there's variability. We see that the effectiveness of instruction varies. And within each of these samples are a number of primary studies, each of which contributed different effects. And so what we're going to do now is explore a little bit unpack this a little bit to see how and when, under what circumstances, instruction is more or less effective. And the organizing principle here is sort of target domain. Okay, so first we'll do, I'm just going to show a little bit talk about grammar instruction, and then vocabulary instruction, pragmatics instruction, and pronunciation instruction. It's kind of an overview of different major areas of ISLA and what meta-analysis has taught us about learning and teaching in these domains. So first of all, I think a great place to start here, and I recommend everybody read this paper by Norris and Ortega, 2000. Effectiveness of L2 instruction, a research synthesis, and quantitative meta-analysis. This is really a landmark paper in SLA for a couple different reasons. For what it taught us about the effectiveness of second language instruction, but also as it served as a kind of introduction to meta-analysis for much of the field. And so this really led to a huge movement towards thinking synthetically and producing meta-analytic research in the field. You can see that as of, this is winter, early 2021, this has been cited almost 3,000 times. So it's had a really big influence on the field. And going back to sort of early, the source of meta-analysis, well, we often say that necessity is the mother of invention. And that was the case for the educational researchers and psychologists that developed meta-analysis in the late 1970s, but also here in the case of SLA, when Norris and Ortega saw that there was this massive body of research on L2 instruction, and there were people arguing that, is instruction even effective and versus exposure only to the target language? That was a real debate happening in the 80s and 90s. And so they're able to systematically bring together that body of research to aggregate it, and in doing so, provide really compelling evidence of the effectiveness of L2 instruction, while also, like I said, introducing meta-analysis to the field. So what do we get? So I'm saying we get these great views of findings. Well, what do we get? We see, first of all, so their meta-analysis, Norris and Ortega, their overall effect is a d-value, which if you're used to thinking about calculating descriptive statistics, a d-value you can think of a little bit like a z-score, or it's expressed in standard deviation units. We think of it as the difference between groups expressed in standard deviation units. So on average, across all the studies that they included in their sample, in this case, there were 49, that's what the K value represents, 49 primary studies, they found an overall difference of about 1 standard deviation, fairly large effect, between control groups and treatment or intervention experimental groups. 15 years later, Gu et al. Also looked at the effectiveness of grammar instruction and found a similar d-value. So we see that result was kind of confirmed. We see here's the Gu et al. Overall effective grammar instruction on an immediate post-test. But what meta-analysis gives us is not only, and I think this is sometimes a problem in the way that people perceive and use meta-analytic results, is that there's too much emphasis on the overall meta-analytic outcome. I think that's very interesting, but to me, the more interesting results actually come from what comes next. What we get next are what are called moderator analyses. And this is when we look at under what conditions or with which learners or which types of treatments effect sizes vary within a given domain. So it's interesting to know that overall, the effectiveness of instruction compared to no instruction or traditional or experimental treatments versus control treatments is about 1 standard deviation of difference. That's interesting, but it's to me even more interesting to then say, okay, what if we look at different types of instruction, or what if we look at longer versus short interventions? What if we look at different target features, and then we see how these might differ systematically? That's we also get that out of meta-analysis under what's called moderator analysis. And so if we look into that, so what else do we get? Well, we see that Norris and Ortega also found that explicit instruction leads to substantially larger effects than implicit instruction. Okay, and so that kind of thing is we can get real practical implications sort of immediately from that. What else do we get? See, and this is Gu et al. They found the same thing, that explicit instruction on an immediate post-test produces substantially larger effects than implicit instruction. Okay, both lead to learning, right? But we can see that the effect is substantially larger at 1.36, a d-value of 1.36 versus a d-value of 0.83. Okay. What else? Well, Shintani, Lee, and Ellis in their meta-analysis of grammar instruction, in this case, they looked at it took a little bit of a different angle. They were looking at comprehension-based instruction versus production-based instruction. And they found that the former had a substantially larger effect on learning than the latter. You can see the overall d-value looking at comprehension-based instruction versus production-based instruction. Again, both are really effective, but they found a larger effect overall for comprehension-based instruction than for production-based instruction. What else? Looking at target features. So we've been looking at type of instruction, right? Explicit, implicit, comprehension-based, production-based. Spot and Tomita in 2010 looked at both of these variables, type of instruction and type of target feature, and they classified interventions as teaching complex features or simple features. And they found that both, again, explicit instruction leads to larger effects than implicit instruction, but also the instruction on complex features actually produced larger effects than instruction on simple features. Okay, and then we also see that one other important moderator that we see is that the effects of grammar instruction vary not only as a function of type of instruction and type of linguistic target feature, but also they vary as a function of the outcome measure or the way that we measure learning in these studies. So we see that more controlled outcome measures or post-tests, more controlled types like multiple choice lead to larger effects than more open-ended ones, more spontaneous ones. And that was found as well in Mackey and Gu. Okay, so how about we look at a different target domain, second language vocabulary instruction. What do we see there? Okay, I'm not going to go into as much depth here, but just a little bit, just to kind of give you a sense of what kinds of results we get from this kind of study and how they can inform future research, inform practice, and lots of different areas of the field. So overall effects of vocab instruction, not quite as effective as grammar instruction. We see d-values, these average meta-analytic d-values around 0.7, which is still a moderate effect size for looking across for the field of second language research. But then immediately I want to know, well, what else? There are many values that went in to create that average d-value of 0.69 or 0.75. Is there systematic variability in that sample of d-values or of vocab instruction effects? Let's find out. So just to give a couple of examples, what Wan 2008 did was look at as one potential moderator variable, whether or not vocabulary instruction included or did not include first language support. And they found that when vocab instruction does include first language support, the effects are substantially larger than when first language support is not provided as part of the vocabulary instruction, right? So that's a finding that has really immediate implications. In different contexts, we can also look at, in this case, Chu looking at high school learners versus elementary school learners and finding substantially larger effects at high school and college level learners over elementary learners. So differences in the effect of vocabulary instruction based on learners' educational level. How about the realm of pragmatics instruction? What do we see there? There's been a few meta-analyses of pragmatics instruction, and we see, okay, overall, there's actually a fairly large difference here. This early meta-analysis back in 2006 found a d-value of just about 0.6. More recently, we found a larger effect. We included obviously a much larger sample. Here we have 50 primary studies as opposed to 13. We see a fairly large effect for pragmatics instruction, L2 pragmatics instruction. But then immediately again, we want to know, well, what else? what else do we know about the effectiveness of pragmatics instruction? Is there any systematic variability across the sample of studies? And we know that, and we see that, yes, there is. Yeah, we see that, again, explicit instruction explicit pragmatics instruction produces larger effects than implicit instruction. And both the meta-analyses of pragmatics instruction have found that. 1.91 versus 1.01 for explicit versus implicit, 1.68 versus 1.27, again, explicit greater than implicit, although both, again, did have a positive effect on learning. And we also see that, what are other moderators of interest? We also see that longer interventions produce greater effects, larger effects. So Zhang and Kaya categorized the primary studies in their sample according to long and short, and they found that the average effect in the longer studies was greater than the studies with a shorter intervention. We took a slightly different approach in this more recent meta-analysis, and what we did was we looked at the length of the intervention, and we kept that as a continuous variable, and we correlated that with the effect of the treatment and found a fairly sizable and positive relationship, indicating that the longer the treatment, the larger the effect was that was likely to be observed for the pragmatics instruction. We can also see, looking at these are just more examples of ways of looking at moderators for pragmatics instruction. So larger effects for productive tasks versus receptive tasks, larger effects for spontaneous or free outcome measures as opposed to controlled, larger effects for written tests versus spoken texts of pragmatics. And then finally, Kazuya, this is an area where you're extremely active and a prominent researcher yourself. L2 pronunciation instruction. Okay, so another really exciting area. And here we see we've had a few different meta-analyses of the effects of pronunciation instruction as well. Lee et al. Looked at overall production training. Sakai and Mormon looked at perception and production. And you can see there the overall effects. But again, you know what I'm going to say now, but I want to know immediately what else, right? What other findings do we have that help us understand the conditions under which these effects might vary systematically? Well, what do we see? We see, this is from the Lee et al. Meta-analysis, we see that a number of different features of the interventions themselves are associated with bigger or smaller effects. So we see here in this one, we did classify, this might have been based on the median length. I can't remember right now, but we found much larger effects for longer interventions, more than twice as big of an effect for longer interventions than shorter interventions. We see the effects also varied as a function of who provided the treatment. And then we see some variability also in the effectiveness of pronunciation instruction based on the target feature, what type of feature was being taught in the treatment. We also see in this realm, this is a project Kazuya and I worked on, Saito and Plonsky 2019. And what we did in this paper was we looked at, but we proposed this sort of framework for different outcome measures in the realm of pronunciation assessment following pronunciation instruction. And then we looked at each of those different types of outcome measures in the classification scheme as a predictor of, or as a subgroup for looking at the effects of L2 pronunciation instruction. And what you can see here is that, again, we have systematic and fairly wide variability across the different types of outcome measures in this framework. Meaning what? Meaning that it's very important that we pay attention to how we assess the effectiveness of second language pronunciation instruction. Okay, so that's it. And so I just want to conclude and make a couple of final points. First, I want to say, for anybody who's maybe fairly new to the field, there's a massive body of research out there on instructed second language acquisition. Hundreds, probably more accurate to say thousands of studies. Now, those of us who do this type of research, most of us care deeply about the research, but we also care deeply about practice. This research, these thousands of studies, really collectively and individually have important implications for practice, important implications for, of course, instruction, but also other areas of L2 practice like assessment, curriculum, language policy, language materials development, etc. So we want these studies, these thousands of studies, they have important contributions to make, but it's really difficult to look at them in a way that that they can be applied immediately to practice. And so what I want you guys to consider, and where I see a lot of potential is in using meta-analysis, in that it provides us with this very powerful tool for systematically looking across the body of research to find out what are the accumulated findings. When you distill it all together, what does it tell us about our questions of interest? Not just the overall effects, but at the moderators as well, which are where I think the most interesting findings are going to be. And then I just hope, and I expect actually, but I also anticipate that L2 research will continue to turn to meta-analysis as a very powerful tool that we can use to help take stock of and synthesize and aggregate and inform, and also actually direct our understanding in this domain of instructed second language acquisition. So with that, I think I will stop. Thank you so much for your attention, and I hope this was useful in some way.
Yeah, again, thank you, Luke. It was so helpful and also quite informative, and especially something like this is very beneficial for future SLA students who are thinking of their future career, and also my graduate students who are currently looking for their topic for dissertation and so on. And yeah, and if I may, can I ask some quick questions?
Of course.
Yeah, thank you, Luke. Yeah. So, yeah, as I said earlier, probably this talk is definitely essential and informative for young students and looking for a topic for dissertation. And and then for let's say for MA students, what kind of advice would you give to them if they're interested in actually conducting meta-analysis, but for the first time?
That's a really good question. I would say that it's I would probably I would say that master's dissertation could certainly be a small scale meta-analysis. In that case, I might recommend taking a fairly narrow scope. So meta-analyses can vary in terms of their scope. Some are very broad, some are much more narrow. I might focus on a very narrow topic, and then also maybe try to give yourself maybe set a number and say, okay, I'm going to try to include 15 or 20 studies, and maybe I'll stop there. And that otherwise, that's just a practical suggestion, because if you're trying to graduate, in the next 3 or 4 months, for example, for a master's student working on a master's dissertation, you can't let the search and the coding go on forever. So some of these studies, I've been a part of some projects that have involved over 100 hours of just searches.
Oh, I see. That would be totally not feasible for MA students.
Yeah. But I would say, and also, you could think of it as a way to get to know that domain really well, and also just teach you the process. So actually going through the steps of doing it would teach a student the process. So very useful, I think.
I see. When it comes to the the understanding of statistical analysis, what kinds of resource would you recommend?
Good question. Meta-analysis, a lot of people think of it as a really sophisticated procedure, and
that's what a lot of people think. Yeah.
So a lot of the stats involved are usually very basic. We're talking about frequencies, percentages, and then just descriptives. So mean and standard deviations, and then that's about it. We're essentially what we're calculating here in many cases is essentially an average, maybe a weighted average, and there are other techniques that can be applied, but it doesn't have to be. It can be as simple as an average or a weighted average.
Right. I see. Okay. So probably I should definitely recommend my students check your maybe books and chapters and articles on this topic. I assume.
There's lots of good resources. There's lots of great sort of tutorials that are out there that can be used. Yeah.
Okay, I see. So now I actually have another question, especially for professionals. So as of 2021, yeah, as you beautifully summarized, the number of the meta-analysis papers, has been definitely increasing dramatically. And yeah, we can see a number of topics meta-analyzed in a very different way. So, for professionals who are thinking of actually doing meta-analysis and aiming at publications, so what kinds of topics do you think are currently meta-analyzable? Something that, or you yourself, kind of interested in, like what kind of topics do you think are going to be, suitable for this type of analysis?
That's a hard question to answer for me because really the answer is any topic that has been addressed by multiple studies. And so anytime there are multiple studies addressing a common question, and of course, they all differ to some extent, and it's up to the researcher. This is a really, really difficult step of the process. Is you have to know a domain well enough to say, okay, I think that these are really addressing this common question, even though the wording of the research questions might be different.
I see.
That's challenging, but any topic that has been addressed by multiple studies could be synthesized via meta-analysis. I'll say though that if a student, let's say a student or professional, isn't sure whether or not a study is a particular domain is ready to be meta-analyzed,
I see. That's a good point.
To engage in in what's called a scoping review, and a scoping review is can be used as a preliminary step to sort of take a survey of the domain to see, not to meta-analyze it yet, but to say what's out there. And then maybe you realize when you do the scoping review, you realize what topics or questions have been addressed sufficiently that they might be ready for meta-analysis.
I see. Okay, yeah. What would be some kind of like a benchmark or threshold that you likely use in terms of assessing the maturity of the topic?
That's really hard to say too, but because it's but I would say if you can't include at least maybe 20 studies, then I probably wouldn't run a meta-analysis.
I see.
20 or more, because and again it just goes to it's again in parallel to primary studies, to primary research, what we want to produce is a stable estimate of the relationship of interest. And if you have too few, that estimate isn't going to be necessarily stable or generalizable. And so we want, and the other thing is the larger the sample of primary studies we get, the more we're able to look at moderators or predictors of that effect. So by having more studies, we can then, if you have only like 10 studies, well, imagine it's hard to then form subgroups and compare them, because
that's true.
Those based on 3 or 4 or 5 studies each, and that's not going to be a very stable estimate.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. Okay. And so actually, probably everyone who is watching this must be interested in this. So how do you view the trends, the changing over the past sort of like 10 years or so, in terms of meta-analysis in the field of SLA? Because the very original meta-analysis study came out around 2000, and now, 20 years actually have passed, and you have obviously been observing the growth and the evolution of this analysis methodology in SLA. Like, do you notice some patterns or issues?
So lots of things have been happening. It's really exciting. We've seen the growth in the quantity of meta-analysis, but we've also seen the growth in the quality.
I've seen quality as well.
Quality as well. I think that we're using the techniques mostly, I think, effectively. I sometimes have a little bit of concern about people who are engaged in meta-analysis who don't necessarily understand the research areas themselves in a deep way. So I think that we definitely don't want to remove the researcher knowledge of the domain from the process. So that's sometimes a concern I have. But what's been interesting also to see is the expansion and the use of meta-analytic techniques across different domains and topics. That's been really cool to see. And I'll say also, one of the other things that I've enjoyed over the last decade or so has been the use of meta-analytic and synthetic techniques to understand methodological features. And so that's something that I've been working on and other people as well, using that systematic coding, systematic collection of studies and the coding to understand methodological features, not just substantive findings, but methodological tendencies, trends, practices, changes over time.
Maybe related to this, and this is my final question. So maybe you can introduce us, a little bit about like your favorite meta-analysis papers that you have, let's say, recently read in the field of SLA. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's been lots of really interesting papers recently. Chris Nicklin and Joe Vita, some of you will know, they have a paper just out in Modern Language Journal where they use meta-analytic techniques to look at sampling and power and effect sizes in the realm of second language vocabulary instruction.
Oh, I see.
It takes really very forward-looking forward-looking sort of perspective on sampling and looking at effects in that domain as a way to inform sample sizing and planning. There's a great paper just out. This is not a meta-analysis per se, but a paper on meta-analytic methods. And we've seen, that's another development we've seen in the domain in applied linguistics, is papers discussing meta-analytic methods, which is also helpful. We need that. A paper that's coming out really soon in SSLA, Studies in Second Language Acquisition, by a really brilliant scholar named Reza Nourouzian. He's looking at inter-rater reliability in meta-analysis, because you know that the process involves coding. Kazuya, you also are an experienced meta-analyst yourself, and so I know you know all this, but in case it's of interest to other people, I'll say it anyway.
For students, audience.
Yeah, and you're also, I mean, very skilled also in assessment and measurement and inter-rater reliability. I know you live in that world, you know.
Yeah, but thank you.
But for yeah, I'm not going to say anything you don't know, but for others who may not be as familiar, the meta-analytic process involves this coding of the studies, and each of this, and sometimes the coding is really clear, but sometimes there's inferences. The coder has to make inferences, and so of course we include multiple raters, and there's different ways of measuring the agreement. There are things like, of course, percentage agreement or Cohen's kappa we can use, but what this paper coming out in SSLA does is he actually proposes a new index for estimating inter-rater reliability in the context of meta-analysis for categorical variables. So really, really cool paper.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
And also, I loved, I mean, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I absolutely loved working on that paper with you.
Oh, thank you.
Our paper, that 2019 paper, because, we got to, I learned so much about pronunciation working with you, and I just love the combination of our interests coming together to look systematically at the outcome measures, the assessments that are used in studies of instructed L2 pronunciation. And so to me, that was such a fun project to be part of. So thanks so much for including me.
Oh, thank you so much, Luke. Yeah, actually, what you said was quite very much like inspiring to me as well, in terms of the, basically the fact that meta-analysis is a way to sort of look at even critically the methodological practices in a certain areas of SLA. So then by doing a meta-analysis, we can rethink what kind of outcome measures have been used. The paper you just mentioned that we worked on together. Yeah, that was a very, very much eye-opening experience for me too, because never before did I actually even think about the practices, what pronunciation researchers were doing in terms of outcome measures. We always love to talk about like how best to teach or what type of pronunciation teaching, whatever. But when it comes to the outcome measures and practices, that was a really, really great experience for me as a pronunciation teaching researcher. So yeah, it was a very good collaboration between you and me.
Yeah, and that's one of the great things about meta-analysis. We may have a kind of intuition as researchers. Even you, an absolute world expert in pronunciation instruction and in L2 pronunciation research, L2 speech research, but you don't know necessarily to what extent we use different outcome measures. You may have a feeling about it, but we don't know until we look. And so we have to examine these things systematically. And as we found, not only is there wide variability in the types of outcome measures that we use, But importantly, the type of outcome measure that we use is associated with the size of the effect that we observe.
That's really true. Yeah.
And so that's the kind of thing that you can't get just by looking casually at a body of studies. You have to code for that kind of stuff systematically.
Right, that's exactly right. And I was also, very surprised to see how unbalanced the number of type of outcome measures researchers have been using. We obviously found a lot of a variety, but then within this variety, researchers actually so biased towards certain methodologies, yes, but not the others. So
we tend to prefer the ones that are simpler or more straightforward sometimes. Perhaps unfortunately.
Right. Yeah. So I actually thought that working on that paper was actually really good, restarting point for pronunciation researchers to think about our practices, and it's a very good, again, restart for us to make the field more mature and probably more scientific and well-rounded. So yeah. Okay, Luke, thank you so much for everything. So that's it for now for your special guest lecture. So shall we move on to the interview thing?
Yeah, sure. Okay, great.